Let me take a look.
Zora knew she was gambling with her life the very second the words left her lips. "I don't care if you're the king of Seoul's underworld or how many men you've sent to the grave," she said, her voice steady despite the predators guarding the door. "I'm a neurospecialist, and I was paid to find the life you've spent 5 years mourning. If you aren't interested in being more than a ghost, I'll take my bag and leave." She directed the challenge toward the shadows, where Hyun Park sat in a black leather executive chair. His unbuttoned white shirt revealed a canvas of dark, traditional tattoos that promised a violent end to anyone who dared to pity him. Hyun hadn't felt the warmth of another human's touch in 5 long years, not since the assassination attempt that stole the nerve endings that made him feel like a man. But something in Zora's gaze, a sharp New York grit, stirred a dormant curiosity in his glacial eyes. "5 years is a long time to be dead while you're still breathing, Hyun," she whispered, leaning into his space. Ignoring the lethal tattoos and the hard planes of his abs, she let her hand hover just inches above a specific nerve cluster on his lower abdomen. "If you're as brave as the stories say," she breathed, her hand finally making contact with that one sensitive spot, "then let me prove you're still alive." The second her skin touched his, Hyun's entire frame went rigid. It wasn't the jagged shock of pain he was used to. It was a white-hot spark of sensation he thought had been buried in the wreckage of his past. As he reached out, his powerful hand pulling her closer, Zora realized that waking a sleeping dragon came with a heavy price. The question is, when the Mafia comes to collect, will she be the one to pay? There is only one way to find out. Do not touch that dial. Welcome back to the channel, besties. Before we dive into the story, if you are new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's proceed with the story. How far would you go to save a man who has lost everything? The humidity of Seoul hung heavy and thick as Zora Sterling stepped out of the black sedan, but the air inside the Lot World Tower penthouse was chilled to a surgical precision. As the private elevator hissed open, she was met not by a welcoming committee, but by a wall of suits. 4 men, their postures as rigid as the steel beams of the skyscraper, stood guard with eyes that scanned her medical bag as if it contained a detonator. Zora didn't blink. She straightened the lapels of her navy scrubs, her stethoscope cold against her neck, and adjusted the strap of her bag. She had spent 10 years in the trauma wards of New York City. She had seen death. She had seen desperation, and she certainly wasn't going to be rattled by men who looked like they'd been carved from obsidian. "I'm Zora Sterling," she said, her voice echoing off the minimalist marble walls. "I believe I'm expected." The lead guard, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, stepped forward. "The master is in a foul mood, Miss Sterling. Most doctors don't make it past the foyer before they beg to leave. Are you sure you want to do this?" "I didn't fly 15 hours to discuss his temperament," Zora replied, her tone clipping with professional steel. "Now, are you going to show me to my patient, or am I going to have to find him myself?" The guard's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a flicker of grim respect. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the towering mahogany doors at the end of the hall. As the doors swung open, the lighting dimmed. The room was a sprawling expanse of glass and shadows, overlooking the glittering neon veins of the city below. In the center of the room, silhouetted against the moonlight, sat a man in a high-backed leather chair. He didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply sat there, a dark, immovable force that seemed to pull the very warmth from the room. Hyun Park was exactly what the files had promised. A kingpin who had been turned into a statue. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned, draped carelessly over his shoulders, revealing the terrifyingly beautiful ink that climbed his neck and spilled across his chest. Dragons and lotus flowers entwined in a dance of permanent shadow. Zora walked toward him, her footsteps steady. "Mr. Park," she began, stopping just beside his chair. "I've read your charts. I've seen the reports from the surgeons in Tokyo and the specialists in London. They all say the same thing, that there is no physiological reason for your paralysis. They call it a miracle of survival and a mystery of failure." Hyun finally turned his head. His eyes were the color of flint, cold and dangerously sharp. He looked at her not as a doctor, but as an intruder. His silence was a weapon, designed to make people stumble, to make them apologize for existing in his space. "You're wasting your breath," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry earth shifting. "And you're wasting my time. Leave the way you came." Zora didn't move. In fact, she leaned in closer, invading the personal space that no one else dared to touch. She could smell the faint scent of expensive sandalwood and the metallic tang of old adrenaline. "I don't care about your time, and I don't care about your mood," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his. "I care about the fact that you've let your mind build a prison for a body that is still perfectly capable of feeling. You think you're a monster because you're broken. No. You're just a coward hiding behind a desk." A low, dangerous growl vibrated in his chest. One of his hands, resting on the arm of the chair, twitched, a micro movement that most would have missed, but Zora's eyes tracked it with predatory precision. "Careful, nurse," he warned, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. "You have no idea who you are speaking to." "I know exactly who you are," Zora countered, reaching into her bag and pulling out a reflex hammer, the silver head catching the moonlight. "You're a man who hasn't felt his own strength in 5 years, and I'm the woman who's going to make you feel it, whether you want me to or not." She didn't wait for his permission. She knelt beside his chair, her presence a bold, vibrant defiance against the darkness of his fortress. The glacier of soul had met his match, and for the first time in half a decade, the ice began to crack. The heavy velvet curtains of the penthouse muffled the roar of the city, creating a vacuum where only the sound of Zora's steady breathing and the low hum of the climate control existed. Di-Hyun remained perched in his leather throne, his gaze fixed on the floor-to-ceiling glass. He looked like a masterpiece of tragedy, a man built for action, covered in the ink of a warrior, yet rendered as still as a tombstone. Zora didn't ask for permission as she moved her equipment closer. She snapped on a pair of nitrile gloves, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. "The surgeons looked at your spine, Di-Hyun. They looked at the L4 and L5 vertebrae, they checked for lesions, and they found nothing. But they weren't looking at the right map." "I told you," he murmured, his voice a jagged edge of exhaustion. "There is nothing to see. The nerves are dead." "Nerves don't just die without a cause," Zora countered, her fingers gently but firmly beginning to palpate the muscles of his quadriceps. They were dense, hard as corded rope, but dormant. "They retreat, they hide, especially when the mind decides that feeling is too dangerous." She moved her hand upward, tracing the line where the dragon tattoo on his thigh met the edge of his slacks. She felt the slight tremor in his frame, not a movement of the muscles, but a vibration of his spirit. He was fighting her, building a mental wall to match the physical one. "Tell me about the night of the accident," she said softly, her eyes focused on her work. "No. 5 years ago. Rain, a motorcade. You weren't alone in that car, were you?" Di-Hyun's jaw tightened so hard the tendons in his neck stood out in sharp relief. The flint in his eyes clouded over with a dark, suffocating memory. "It doesn't matter who was there. They're gone." Zora stopped. She looked up, her face inches from his. "It matters because your body is grieving. You think that if you stand up, if you walk, you're walking away from them. You've anchored yourself to that wreckage because you think your paralysis is the only way to stay loyal to the dead." The silence that followed was deafening. Di-Hyun turned his head slowly, his eyes burning with a sudden, feral intensity. "You know nothing of my loyalty. You are a guest in this house. Do not mistake my silence for weakness." "Then show me your strength," Zora challenged. She reached for the specific nerve cluster she had identified earlier, the one buried deep beneath the ink on his lower abdomen, just above the hip bone. In her research, she had called it the reset switch. It was the intersection where physical trauma and psychological scarring met. She leaned in, her shoulder brushing against his unbuttoned shirt. The warmth of his skin radiated against her, a stark contrast to the cold marble of the room. With a precise, firm pressure, she pressed her thumb into the hidden junction of nerves. "Let go, Di-Hyun," she whispered, her voice a soothing command. "Let the ghost go." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the air in the room seemed to shift. Di-Hyun's breath hitched, a sharp, choked sound escaping his throat. Beneath Zora's thumb, a muscle jumped. It was a small, violent spasm, an involuntary surge of electricity that traveled from his core down to his knee. Di-Hyun's eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they were almost entirely black. His hand flew out, gripping Zora's wrist with a strength that was sudden and terrifying. He wasn't pushing her away. He was holding on, his knuckles white as he stared at his own leg in disbelief. "Did you feel that?" Zora asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. He didn't answer immediately. He was trembling, a deep, rhythmic shudder that started in his chest and radiated outward. The glacier wasn't just cracking, it was screaming. I felt heat," he rasped, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that stripped away the mafia boss and left only the man. He looked at Zora, and for the first time, the promised violence in his eyes was replaced by a desperate, raw hope. He pulled her wrist closer, his thumb grazing the pulse point of her hand. The touch was electric, a bridge built over 5 years of silence. "Don't stop," he whispered, the command sounding more like a prayer. "Zora, please don't stop." Zora felt the professional walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. She was the nurse, and he was the patient, but in the shadows of that penthouse, as his heat seeped into her skin, she knew the healing had finally begun, and that the price for it would be higher than either of them ever imagined. The following weeks in the penthouse were marked by a silence that was no longer empty, but heavy with the electric hum of a shared secret. Zora pushed Di-Hyun with a relentless, clinical mercy that left them both exhausted. The sessions grew longer, moving from the velvet shadows of his office to the sun-drenched, glass-walled therapy suite he had installed at her request. As the physical therapy intensified, so did the connection between them. Zora was no longer just a voice in the dark. She was the architect of his resurrection. Every day, her hands, strong, sure, and warm, mapped the terrain of his body, seeking out the dormant sparks. She worked his legs until the muscles burned, a sensation Di-Hyun greeted with a near-religious fervor. To feel pain was to be alive, and to be alive was to belong to the woman who had willed it so. "Again," Zora commanded, her brow dampened by a fine sheen of sweat. She stood behind the parallel bars, her hands hovering just inches from his waist as he attempted to shift his weight. Di-Hyun grunted, his face contorting with a mix of agony and triumph. For the first time in 5 years, he could feel the texture of the floor beneath his feet, the coolness of the polished wood, the slight friction of his grip. But more than the physical sensation, he was hyper-aware of her proximity. He could hear the rhythm of her heart, smell the faint, clean scent of her cocoa butter lotion, and feel the heat radiating from her body. His senses weren't just returning, they were magnifying, centering entirely on her. When she adjusted his posture, the brush of her scrubs against his skin felt like a live wire. When she leaned in to check his pulse, the sight of her short, dark curls against the sunlight made his breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "You're starring, Mr. Park," Zora said, her voice teasing but underlined with a sudden, sharp tension. She stepped around to face him, her eyes searching his. "I am observing my progress," he rasped, though the lie felt thin between them. He reached out, his fingers tracing the silver stethoscope draped around her neck. It was a bold move, an encroachment on her professional space that should have made her pull away. Instead, she held his gaze, her chest rising and falling in a jagged rhythm. The glacier was gone. In his place was a man whose obsession was beginning to eclipse his pain. Di-Hyun found himself watching her even when the sessions were over. From his chair, he tracked her movements through the reflection in the glass as she packed her bag. He noticed the way she hummed when she was focused, the way she bit her lip when she was worried about a particular nerve response. She was becoming his world, the singular point of light in a life that had been defined by darkness and steel. It was a dangerous fixation. In the world of the Park Syndicate, vulnerability was a death sentence, and Zora Sterling was becoming the greatest vulnerability he had ever known. His men noticed the change, the way his eyes followed her, the way the air in the room seemed to charge whenever she entered. They saw the tiger waking up, but they also saw the chains he was willingly forging for himself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Seoul skyline, painting the room in bruised purples and golds, Zora finished a particularly grueling session. She was kneeling at his feet, massaging the tension from his calves, when Di-Hyun reached down and caught her chin with his hand. The touch was no longer clinical. It was possessive. "You've given me back my body, Zora," he whispered, his thumb grazing her lower lip. The flint in his eyes had turned to a dark, molten gold. But I think you've taken something else in return. Zora didn't move. She didn't breathe. The professional nurse from New York was still there, but the woman beneath the navy scrubs was drowning in the intensity of his stare. I'm just doing my job, Di-hyun, she breathed, though her voice lacked conviction. No, he countered, leaning down until their foreheads touched, the scent of him overwhelming her senses. You're making me want things a dead man has no right to want. The silence that followed was a physical weight, a promise and a threat entwined. Di-hyun was no longer just a patient recovering from a tragedy. He was a predator rediscovering his hunger. And Zora, despite every ethical wall she had built, realized she was no longer just his healer. She was the prize he was beginning to value more than his own empire. The invitation wasn't a request. It was an unveiling. When the sleek black evening gown arrived at Zora's quarters, accompanied by a box of diamonds that looked like frozen tears, she understood that the sanctuary of the therapy suite had been a temporary illusion. Di-hyun was no longer content to be her secret patient. He wanted her by his side as he reclaimed his throne. The venue was a subterranean ballroom beneath a five-star hotel, a place where the air tasted of vintage cognac and expensive tobacco. As Zora entered, draped in the silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, she felt the weight of 100 eyes. These weren't the curious stares of Seoul's socialites. These were the cold, predatory gazes of men who dealt in blood and leverage. Di-hyun was waiting for her at the head of a long, obsidian-topped table. He looked magnificent, a dark prince returned from the dead. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, the silk of the lapels catching the light, yet even the formal wear couldn't hide the primal power radiating from him. He stood as she approached, his movements fluid and certain, a far cry from the man who had been a prisoner of his own nerves weeks ago. You look breathtaking, Dr. Sterling, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled straight to her core. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her bare arm as he led her to the seat beside him. The touch was possessive, a silent declaration to everyone in the room that she was under his protection. But as the dinner progressed, the romantic haze began to dissipate, replaced by the lethal reality of Di-hyun's world. The business discussed over Wagyu beef and aged wine was a ledger of intimidation. Zora watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Di-hyun dismantled a rival's territory with a few soft-spoken words. The port in Incheon is mine, Di-hyun said, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze the harbor itself. He didn't raise his voice, but the man across from him, a scarred veteran of the underworld, visibly paled. If your trucks move without my seal, they won't make it to the highway. Is that clear? Zora looked at the man she had spent hours coaxing back to life. The hands that had trembled with the effort of a single step were now steady as he swirled his wine, eyes as cold as the flint she had first encountered. She saw the way his men looked at him, not with respect, but with a terrifying, absolute fear. The climax of the evening came when a younger man, emboldened by too much whiskey, dared to question Di-hyun's miracle recovery. We heard the dragon had lost his fire, the man sneered, his eyes darting toward Zora. Is this the little nurse who's been playing doctor in your penthouse? The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Di-hyun didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a speed that made Zora gasp, he stood and leaned across the table. He gripped the man's throat with the very hand Zora had spent weeks rehabilitating. The strength was raw, unyielding, and terrifying. She is the reason I am standing, Di-hyun hissed, his face inches from the trembling man. And she is the reason you are still breathing. For now, if you ever speak of her again, I will remind you why they call me the Glacier. He released the man, who collapsed back into his chair, gasping for air. Di-hyun turned to Zora, his expression softening only for her, though the darkness remained in the depths of his eyes. I think it's time we left, he said quietly. As they walked out through the gauntlet of bowed heads, Zora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had healed the man, but in doing so, she had unleashed the dragon. She was no longer just a nurse from New York. She was a player in a game where the stakes were life and death, and she was the only thing Di-hyun Park valued more than his crown. See, the penthouse was buried in the heavy, velvet silence of 3 a.m, the only light coming from the moon bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the dim, amber glow of the home gym's recessed fixtures. The air was thick with the scent of rubber, expensive leather, and the salt of exertion. Zora stood behind Hyun, her hands braced against his broad shoulders as he sat on a low bench, the sheer effort of his final set of back extensions leaving his skin slicked with a fine sheen of sweat. "Focus, Hyun," Zora whispered, her voice low and raspy from hours of coaching. "Your lower lumbar is taking the load. Engage the core. Remember the mapping we did." Hyun let out a jagged breath, his muscles rippling beneath the ink that covered his back like a shifting tapestry. The dragons on his shoulder blades seemed to flex with every movement. He was no longer the porcelain doll she had met weeks ago. He was a machine of war being meticulously rebuilt. But as he leaned forward to finish the rep, he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned back, his head coming to rest against Zora's abdomen, his heat soaking through her navy scrubs. Zora's breath hitched. She should have stepped back. She should have adjusted her posture, maintained the professional distance that was the bedrock of her ethics. But her fingers lingered on the heat of his skin, tracing the edge of a tattoo that disappeared into the waistband of his slacks. The glacier was burning, and she was the one fanning the flames. "You're trembling, Zora," Hyun murmured, his voice a deep vibration that she felt in her own bones. It's been a long session," she lied, her voice lacking its usual clinical edge. "We should stop." Hyun turned slowly on the bench, his eyes dark and molten in the shadows. He reached up, his large, calloused hand catching hers, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist. Her heart was a frantic bird against his skin. He looked at her not as a patient seeking a cure, but as a man who had finally found the one thing worth more than his life. "You told me you were here to do a job," he said, pulling her hand toward his chest, right over his heart. "You said you didn't care who I was, but you're looking at me now and you aren't seeing a patient." Zora felt her professional resolve, the iron nurse persona she had cultivated in New York, simply dissolve. The man before her was a lethal kingpin, a man who had seen the darkest corners of the world, yet he was looking at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. She saw the scar on his chest where the bullet had nearly taken him, and the way his skin reacted to her touch, the nerves finally, fully awake. "I can't be both, Hyun," she whispered, her other hand coming up to cup his jaw, her thumb tracing the sharp line of his chin. "I can't be the one who heals you and the one who wants this." "Why not?" he challenged, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous rasp. He stood up, his height now looming over her, the physical restoration complete enough for him to tower over her with a predatory grace. "I am the master of this city, Zora. I take what I want. And right now, I want the woman who gave me back my life." He didn't wait for her answer. He leaned down, his mouth crashing against hers with a hunger that had been building for 5 years of cold, isolated silence. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a claim. Zora's hands tangled in his hair, her fingers gripping the short, dark strands as she pulled him closer, her back hitting the cool glass of the gym wall. The boundaries didn't just break. They shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The stethoscope around her neck felt like a relic from a past life. In the dim light of the penthouse gym, amidst the weights and the shadows, Zora Sterling stopped being a nurse. She became the fire that the glacier couldn't resist, and as Hyun's hands found the sensitive spot on her waist she had once treated, she knew there was no going back. The price of his recovery had just been paid in full, and the debt was her heart. The cold morning air of Seoul felt like a splash of ice water against Zora's face as she stepped out of the private clinic's side entrance. Her shift had been brief, a consultation for a rare nerve case, but her mind was still back in the penthouse, tangled in the memory of Hyun's touch. She walked toward the subway station, her medical bag heavy on her shoulder, trying to ignore the prickle of unease at the base of her neck. It started as a low hum, a black SUV with tinted windows that had slowed to a crawl 2 blocks back. Zora quickened her pace, her heart beginning to drum a frantic rhythm. She turned into a narrow, bustling alleyway lined with neon signs and steaming food stalls, hopping to lose the tail in the crowd. But as she glanced over her shoulder, 2 men in gray tactical jackets stepped out of the shadows, their eyes fixed on her with a predatory stillness that screamed White Tiger Syndicate. Zora didn't wait. She bolted. Her scrubs felt like a bright target against the gray concrete. She ducked behind a stack of wooden crates, her fingers trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She didn't call the police. In this city, for a man like Hyun, the police were secondary to the family. She hit the speed dial. "Di-hyun," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper as she heard the heavy footfalls of her pursuers. "They're here, the alley off Myeongdong, 3 of them." In the penthouse, 5 miles away, the glacier didn't just crack, it shattered. Di-hyun didn't reach for his cane. He didn't look for his chair. Driven by a surge of adrenaline that bypassed every lingering mental block, he stood up with a roar of primal fury. The 5-year silence was over. He grabbed his jacket and a heavy black handgun from his desk, his legs moving with a terrifying, newfound precision. "Stay on the line, Zora," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration as he sprinted toward the elevator. "If they touch you, I will burn this city to the ground." Back in the alley, the hunters had closed in. Zora found herself backed into a dead-end corner, the smell of rotting garbage and stale rain filling her lungs. The lead attacker, a man with a white tiger tattooed across his throat, pulled a jagged switchblade. "The dragon is weak," the man sneered. "He thinks a nurse can make him a king again. We're going to show him what happens to his toys." Zora gripped her medical bag, her eyes darting for a weapon. "I'm not a toy," she spat, her New York grit flaring up. "And he isn't weak." Just as the man lunged, the screech of tires echoed through the narrow passage. A silver sedan slammed into the mouth of the alley, skidding to a halt. The door flew open before the car had even stopped. Di-hyun emerged like a phantom of vengeance. He didn't stumble. He didn't limp. He moved with the grace of a predator who had finally been released from its cage. The first syndicate member didn't even see the blow coming. Di-hyun's fist connected with his jaw with the force of a sledgehammer, sending the man sprawling into a pile of steel drums. The man with the throat tattoo turned, his eyes widening in pure terror. You're supposed to be paralyzed." "I was," Di-hyun hissed, stepping into the light, his white shirt stained with the sweat of his exertion and his eyes glowing with a murderous light. "Until you threatened what belongs to me." The fight was short and brutal. Di-hyun's recovery was put to the ultimate test, his muscles screaming under the sudden, violent strain, but he didn't falter. He moved through the attackers with a cold, calculated efficiency, a master of violence reclaimed. When the last man lay groaning on the wet pavement, Di-hyun didn't look at his handiwork. He turned to Zora. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands, the hands she had spent months healing, reaching out to cup her face. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his ink-covered skin hot to the touch. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his eyes searching hers for even a scratch. Zora shook her head, her breath hitching as she looked at the man standing before her. He was fully restored, a terrifyingly powerful kingpin who had just crossed a line of no return. "You saved me," she whispered. "I saved myself," he countered, pulling her into a crushing embrace, his heart beating a frantic, living rhythm against hers. "Because without you, Zora, there is nothing left to save." The shadows of the alley seemed to deepen, a silent warning that the war had only just begun. The White Tiger Syndicate had struck, and the dragon had answered. As Di-hyun led her toward the car, Zora knew the sanctuary of the clinic was gone forever. She was no longer just his healer, she was his queen, and the city was about to bleed for it. The silver sedan didn't return to the penthouse. Instead, it descended into the bowels of a reinforced concrete fortress disguised as a luxury commercial complex in Gangnam. Zora watched the heavy steel gates hiss shut behind them, the sound echoing with a finality that made her chest tighten. When the car stopped, Di-hyun didn't wait for his men. He stepped out, his movements fluid and sharp, and opened Zora's door himself. He didn't offer his hand. He gripped hers, his fingers interlocking with hers in a way that was less an invitation and more a claim. "Where are we?" Zora asked, her voice hushed by the sheer scale of the underground bunker. "The only place in this city where the White Tigers cannot reach," Di-hyun replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He led her through a series of biometric scanners and reinforced doors, deep into a space that the public didn't know existed. This was his inner sanctum, the nervous system of his empire. As the final set of doors slid open, Zora gasped. Before her was a high-tech command center that looked more like a war room than a corporate office. Banks of monitors flickered with live feeds from the docks of Incheon, the shipping lanes of the East Sea, and the neon-lit corridors of every major casino in Seoul. Dozens of men and women in sharp suits stood at attention the moment Di-hyun entered. These weren't just bodyguards. They were analysts, hackers, and lieutenants. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and cold, hard power. "You've spent months seeing me as a patient," Dehyun said, walking her toward a massive glass table that displayed a real-time digital map of the city's underground hierarchy. "But this is who I am. Every shipment that enters this country, every high-stakes debt, every secret whispered in the dark, it all flows through me." He gestured to a monitor showing a graininess of the White Tiger Syndicate's headquarters. "They attacked you because they thought I was still a ghost. They thought the dragon was a memory. By saving you today, I didn't just show them I can walk, I showed them I am ready to hunt." Zora walked to the glass wall that overlooked the central hub. She saw the weapons lockers, the stacks of encrypted ledgers, and the sheer scale of the violence required to maintain such an empire. It was a staggering contrast to the quiet, intimate hours they had spent in the penthouse. There, he was a man reclaiming his dignity. Here, he was a god reclaiming his wrath. "You're locking me in," she whispered, turning to face him. The diamonds at her throat caught the cold light of the monitors. "You aren't just protecting me, Dehyun. You're making me a prisoner of your war." Dehyun crossed the room, his footsteps heavy and purposeful on the polished floor. He stopped inches from her, his presence a dark, overwhelming force. He reached out, his hand, the one she had taught to feel again, sliding into her hair, his thumb tracing the curve of her ear. "I am keeping you alive," he corrected, his eyes burning with a possessive, molten intensity. "The White Tigers want to use you to break me. They think you are my weakness. They don't realize you are my heart." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "This sanctum is the shadow of my world, Zora. It is cold, and it is violent, but it is the only place I can guarantee your safety. From this moment on, you do not leave my sight. You do not speak to anyone I haven't vetted. You are the only thing in this empire that isn't for sale, and I will burn every street in Seoul before I let them take a single breath near you again." Zora looked into his eyes and saw the terrifying truth. She had healed the man, but the king she had unleashed was a creature of absolute control. She was no longer just his nurse or even just his lover. She was the crown jewel of a criminal dynasty, hidden away in a fortress of shadows. "Is this the price?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is this what happens when the glacier thaws?" "The price," Dehyun whispered, his mouth inches from hers, "is that you belong to the dragon now, and the dragon never lets go of his treasure." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate seal of his word, while behind them, the monitors flickered with the movements of a city on the brink of a bloodbath. Zora realized with a sinking heart that while she had found his secret spot and healed his body, she had walked into a sanctuary that was also a cage. The war was no longer outside the gates. It was the very air she breathed. The atmosphere inside the Grand Council chamber was thick with the scent of old wood and impending blood. This was the neutral ground, a traditional estate on the outskirts of Seoul, where the heads of the major syndicates met to prevent the city from burning. Zora stood in a small, shadowed alcove behind a lattice screen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Dehyun had insisted she be present, not as a participant, but as a witness to the finality of his choice. Across the low, lacquered table sat the patriarch of the White Tiger Syndicate, a man whose face was a map of scars and ancient grudges. Beside him were the representatives of the other families, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to blatant greed. They had called this meeting for one reason. The dragon had woken up, and he had done so for a woman who didn't belong to their world. "The balance has been disturbed, Dehyun," the White Tiger patriarch rasped, his voice sounding like stones grinding together. "You've spent 5 years as a ghost, leaving the streets to us. Now you return, walking like a king, all because of a foreign nurse who knows too many of our secrets. She is a variable we cannot allow." Dehyun sat at the head of the table, his posture perfect, his hands resting flat on the wood. He looked every bit the lethal monarch Zora had helped him become. "She is my medical specialist," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Her knowledge is clinical, not criminal." "It doesn't matter," a younger boss from the Golden Snake clan interrupted. "She is your pulse, Dehyun, and in our world a man's pulse is his greatest weakness. The families have reached a consensus. To ensure the peace and to prove your loyalty to the code, the woman must be removed. Give her to us or face a united front. Is one nurse worth a citywide war?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. From behind the screen, Zora held her breath, her fingers digging into the silk of her dress. She saw Di-Hyun's shoulders broaden. He didn't look at the screen, but she felt his focus shift toward her. Then, slowly, Di-Hyun stood up. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply leaned forward, his hands bracing against the table as he stared down the most dangerous men in Korea. "You speak of consensus," he began, his voice dropping to a temperature that seemed to frost the very air. "But you forget whose table you are sitting at. You think she is my weakness because she is the one I protect. You are wrong. She is my strength because she is the only reason I bothered to stand up and reclaim what is mine." He walked around the table, his footsteps echoing with the terrifying precision of a man who is no longer broken. "I will make this very simple for all of you. Zora Sterling is no longer just a nurse. She is mine. She is off limits. She is untouchable." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy coin, the seal of the Park Syndicate, and slammed it onto the center of the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "If a single shadow follows her, if a single breath is drawn near her without my permission, I will not just start a war. I will end your lineages. I will burn your docks, seize your assets, and bury your names in the Han River. Does anyone else wish to discuss the price of my healing?" The white tiger patriarch looked at the coin, then up at Di-Hyun's eyes. He saw there a madness and a clarity that terrified him. This wasn't a man negotiating. This was a predator marking his territory. One by one, the other bosses lowered their heads. It was political theater, but the message was absolute. By declaring her untouchable, Di-Hyun had placed her above the law of the streets. He turned toward the lattice screen and held out his hand. Zora stepped out from the shadows, her chin high, meeting the predatory gazes of the council with the same grit she had used in the trauma wards of New York. As she placed her hand in his, Di-Hyun pulled her close to his side, his arm a solid, unyielding bar around her waist. "The meeting is over," Di-Hyun announced to the room, his eyes never leaving the rival patriarch. "And the peace remains as long as you remember who the dragon is protecting." As they walked out of the estate, surrounded by a phalanx of loyal guards, the cool night air hit them. Zora looked at the man beside her, the glacier who had turned into a wildfire for her sake. He had saved her life, but he had also tied her to his destiny forever. The price of his healing had been a public declaration of war, and as the black sedan sped away into the neon night, Zora knew that being untouchable was the most dangerous position in Seoul. The sterile scent of the New York surgical suite was a far cry from the shadowy, sandalwood-infused corners of the Seoul underworld. 6 months had passed since the night of the public declaration, months spent in a high-stakes dance of rehabilitation and rising tension. Now, as the morning sun clawed its way over the Manhattan skyline, Di-Hyun sat on the edge of the recovery bed, his white hospital gown open at the back, exposing the intricate ink of the dragons that had witnessed his entire journey from ghost to king. Zora moved with practiced, clinical efficiency, checking the monitors and the fresh bandage at the base of his spine. The specialized neuromicrosurgery had been a success, a surgical masterpiece that had finally reconnected the physical bridges Zora's hands had first discovered in the dark. "Reflexes are perfect, Di-Hyun," she murmured, her voice thick with a mixture of professional pride and a heavy, lingering sadness. She tapped his knee, watching the leg kick out with a strength that was no longer a miracle, but a reality. "Your coordination is at 98%. By next week, you won't even need the physical therapy sessions." Di-Hyun didn't look at his leg. He looked at Zora. He saw the way she avoided his gaze, the way she was already beginning to retreat into her iron nurse shell. He reached out, his hand warm, steady, and fully alive, catching her wrist as she turned to update his chart. "The blueprints are finished, aren't they?" he asked, his voice a low, resonant vibration. "The medical ones are," Zora replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "My contract with the Park Syndicate is officially fulfilled. You're whole again, Di-Hyun. You don't need a nurse anymore." Di-Hyun stood up. He didn't use the railing. He didn't lean on the bed. He rose with a predatory grace that made the small recovery room feel suddenly much smaller. He towered over her, the power radiating from his frame no longer a threat, but a promise. "You're right," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. "I don't need a nurse. And that is why, as of this moment, Zora Sterling, you are fired." Zora flinched as if he'd struck her. Fired, after everything. I cannot have my partner on the payroll, he interrupted, his voice softening into a seductive, dangerous rasp. He reached into the pocket of his discarded silk robe and pulled out a small velvet box. I didn't bring you to New York just for the surgeons, Zora. I brought you here because this is where we start the life that has nothing to do with blood, debts, or patience. He opened the box, revealing a ring set with a black diamond that looked like a drop of midnight. I've spent 5 years in a prison of my own skin. You broke the locks. You stood between me and the families when I was nothing but a target. Now, I want to stand between you and the rest of the world, not as your patient, but as your man. Zora looked from the ring to the man who had once been a glacier she thought she could never thaw. She saw the scars, the tattoos, and the raw, unyielding love in his flinty eyes. The professional walls she had built in the trauma wards of New York finally, irrevocably collapsed. You're an arrogant, difficult, and incredibly dangerous man, Hyun Park, she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. And you, he countered, sliding the ring onto her finger, the fit perfect and absolute, are the only woman brave enough to tell me so. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, his mouth claiming hers with a finality that signaled the end of the professional and the beginning of the eternal. Outside, the city roared with life, indifferent to the fact that one of the most powerful men in Asia had just surrendered his heart. Hyun broke the kiss just enough to whisper against her lips. The dragon is retired, Zora, but the man is just getting started. As they walked out of the hospital, hand in hand, leaving the scrubs and the shadows of the underworld behind, Zora knew the price had been high, but the reward was a life she had never dared to blueprint. The healing was complete, and for the first time in 5 years, they were both finally, truly home.